And a lot of people say, well, I shouldn't be feeling this way, or I didn't have trauma, or my childhood was fine, or, no, trauma's these other people with these big events, and they don't label it as such. And, for me, I don't care what you call it, but your brain and your body are going to do the same thing anyway. So,
Right.
that's why I like to say all of us have trauma. We can call it whatever you want to, but a lot of people will dismiss their experience or they'll minimize their experience because it doesn't fit that mold of what they thought a real trauma was. So,
Yeah.
I wanted to make sure I said that because a lot of people will dismiss or invalidate their experiences because they don't have a concept of, hey, all of these death by a thousand tiny cuts will still make you bleed out.
Welcome to Settling is Bullshit, a sweary podcast about claiming your joy. If you are an adult human craving healthier boundaries, a greater sense of purpose, or an increased capacity to feel at ease in your own skin, then you are in the right place, my friend. I'm your host, Kate Blauk, and I'm here to offer you practical tools and playful encouragement to help you step forward and be your most awesome self. My hope is that each episode will leave you feeling a bit more empowered to make brave choices and claim your joy. Oh my goodness, y'all. I'm so excited to have this conversation today for a variety of reasons. One of which is the human that I am getting to have this conversation with. She's amazing. I'm here with Dr. Stephanie Goldsmith, licensed clinical psychologist, associate clinical professor, director of a big fancy psychology thing that I can never say right. Steph, what is it called?
It's called Gestalt Associates Training Los Angeles. We're a psychotherapy training program. We're actually the longest running international psychotherapy training program in the world.
Oh my, see, it's amazing. So she's a really big deal, y'all. I don't know if you picked up on that. She's also a big deal to me because she's one of my best friends from college. So there's just like so much yumminess in this conversation for me. Dr. Goldsmith is here to talk to us about the relationship between trauma and joy, which is so important because trauma interrupts joy, and I want us all to live really joyful lives. And I think Steph does too.
Indeed, I think the relationship it's interesting. It can be bidirectional, right? So
Ooh.
they're two concepts that are on the end of the same spectrum. So trauma can interrupt your ability to get to joy, but I think it actually does so in a well-intentioned way.
Okay.
So, or I should say the trauma response does. So
Mm.
once somebody has integrated a trauma response and they get triggered in the future, that's what can interrupt your joy. But it's doing so in a well-meaning way. It's not
Ooh.
trying to make your life difficult. It's actually trying to help you out.
Okay.
And
Okay. There's so many things here. Okay, so trauma is not trying to interrupt my life.
it is, but it's doing so in a well-intentioned manner.
Okay, so trauma has good. Whoa, whoa. Let's start with what is trauma.
Sure, it's actually it's a very amorphous term that a lot of people have a difficulty
Yeah.
defining and explaining. And trauma is very much on a spectrum.
Okay.
So all of us have trauma. There's itty bitty little traumas that we experience every day. And then we have these really big, what we would call a single incident trauma or a big T trauma. That is one of these big incidents is like a car crash or a sexual
Right.
assault or something like that.
Yeah, I
So
think for me, for a long time, like that's what I thought trauma was. And so when I was going through my personal journey of figuring my shit out, I didn't have a like big event to point to. So I was like, oh, I don't have anything. But what has been incredibly helpful for me is recognizing that I had quite a bit of like less big T trauma. Um, and I think that's a common experience, right?
it's definitely a common experience. And that's why I like to say everybody has traumas.
Mhm.
They just impact our lives differently. So, what some people call complex trauma or little t trauma, this is what I like to describe as that death by a thousand tiny cuts, where,
Yeah.
maybe one little incident is something that upsets us, but we move on. But it's a cumulative effect of having a lot of these incidences over time. So, that can be many, many different things. It could be abuse or neglect in childhood over a period of time by a trusted caregiver. We can look at racialized trauma where we see a lot of microaggressions or even kind of overt racism and overt
Mhm.
oppressive actions. And those are traumatic, especially over time, cumulatively. We can see that it really triggers a stress response and it can have a huge health impacts on
Mhm.
people. They can really affect their health outcomes. So trauma is one of these big terms. It can be these
Yeah.
kind of cumulative smaller incidences, or it can be one of these really major life events that it cleaves your life, right? Before and after this big event that happened. So I think that's why a lot of people have difficulty defining it because it can be many different things. But all of us have incidences of trauma. It just depends a lot on how big the incidences are, how long it happened for, at what
Yeah.
point in our development it occurred. So all of these things can have different impacts on people. And then, of course, the person's individual experience, their resilience, their resources, their family system, et cetera, can also impact how they recover or don't recover from trauma.
Yeah. So we all experience traumas. Some have kind of a bigger impact on how we are able to show up in the world than others. How do we determine kind of when trauma is showing up in our lives later down the road? What does that look like?
Many different things, and sometimes the symptoms aren't as obvious. And I think, I wanna answer something you actually said a minute ago before I forget to, is you were talking about how sometimes people don't know to label some of their experiences as trauma because they think of it as the car crash or the sexual assault or the natural disaster or being in a war zone or some of these more stereotypical definitions. It's very, very common in my work as a certified clinical trauma professional. So I see a lot of trauma cases in my practice. And a lot of people say, well, I shouldn't be feeling this way, or I didn't have trauma, or my childhood was fine, or, no, the trauma's these other people with these big events, and they don't label it as such. And, for me, I don't care what you call it, but your brain and your body are going to do the same thing anyway. So,
Right.
that's why I like to say all of us have trauma. We can call it whatever you want to, but a lot of people will dismiss their experience or they'll minimize their experience because it doesn't fit that mold of what they thought a real trauma was. And some people have
Yeah.
traumas that are so early and ongoing that they don't really have words around it. We call that pre-verbal trauma. So they still think, I don't have something to hang my hat on. I don't have something to point to and say, this is the reason why I do that. So,
Yeah.
I wanted to make sure I said that because a lot of people will dismiss or invalidate their experiences because they don't have a concept of, hey, all of these death by a thousand tiny cuts will still make you bleed out. Like it will
Yeah. Oh my
still.
God.
Mhm.
100%. Like, and that was my experience, right? Of just not having a big event to point to and then getting into therapy in adulthood and being like, why the fuck is this happening to me? Why am I showing up this way? What is going on? And then
Mhm.
eventually realizing it was like, oh, because like I was overweight as a kid and was like really heavily bullied at school. And my big brother was really mean to me. And that had a fucking impact on my capacity to be in the world and be okay in my own skin and be in my body. And it turns out that's trauma.
Yes, absolutely. That is absolutely valid trauma. So, and if you think about it, developmentally, when you're a child and these repeated instances are going on, that's how your brain and your nervous system learn how to interact in the environment. So that's where your brain and your body is starting to adapt towards these are the rules, this is how I
Mhm.
can shortcut to act faster because our brains are actually really lazy. They want to do shortcuts as fast as possible. The sooner you can kind of make something procedural, the more effective you can be to move on to the next adaptive learning.
Uh-huh.
So if you're learning something about yourself, oh, you're unlikable, you're too fat, you're
Mhm.
unappreciated in your family system, you're the wrong size, you're the wrong gender, you're the wrong color, whatever these things
Yeah.
are, that becomes automated into your brain and your nervous system
Oh,
so
yeah.
that, that becomes truth that stops being checked out. It becomes automatic and your brain will adapt to that. So when you have these kinds of traumas, you are looking out for safety and danger. So
Mhm.
now your brain is orienting around vigilance. So if you
Right.
have consistent chaotic environment when you're a kiddo, you're now going to be orienting to the external world more than being curious about your internal world.
Oh,
Folks who grow
yeah.
up, yeah, folks who grow up in secure attachment where they are valued and maybe bad things happen, but their, families and their social systems are still really wrapping around them and caring for them. They might say bad things happen, but I'm still okay. I'm still a good person. For
Yeah.
people who have chaotic environments and unsupported caregivers and this kind of stuff, they really learn to orient outside about whether or not they're okay. They come home and they hear
Right.
loud noises and they say, dad's drinking again, I had better go to my room, I better hide, I better leave and go to my friend's house. So they become more vigilant to the outside world. And why that matters is because as they grow up, they've now learned in order to stay safe and in order to regulate myself, I need to be more attentive to the outside world rather than
Mm.
curious about
Okay.
myself and my needs. So they don't
Ooh.
really learn to regulate what's going on inside themselves and to learn, what their desires are, what their path. There's no room for that when you're consistently monitoring for safety.
Ooh, okay. So would you say
So
that's kind of one of the key components of trauma response, being in trauma response, is being just really outwardly oriented and not as able to sort of turn inward and access kind of what's going on in my own system?
yes, more externally oriented, more, attending to that stimuli. And that's why a lot of folks who have especially complex PTSD, which is that kind of developmental trauma, it's why they don't have great memories either from when they're kids, which I hear a lot from people. I don't remember that much from before I was like 11 or 12. I'm like, well, if you were learning to kind of externally orient and look for safety, your brain doesn't have all those resources then to code what we call mundane memories. Like when I was 7 years old, I did a lemonade stand with my friends as a mundane
Right.
memory. And it's not going to code as much because your brain is using so many more resources to adapt around a chaotic environment.
Oh, wow. I'm so glad we're having this conversation. My body just like relaxed hearing that explanation of just like, oh my God, this makes so much sense. So, okay, that's kind of what trauma is, how it happens. And then we get to adulthood. And then how does that kind of tend to impact how we show up in the world? What's going on? What's the through line there?
Well, if this person who's now grown up, who's now learned to orient towards safety and danger, there's less room for feeling safe in relationships. Think about adapting yourself around how do I make sure that I don't get hurt?
Yeah.
You know,
Oof.
right? And
I'm
it's
familiar with that one.
so you see this a lot with damaged attachment relationships in adulthood because especially if the abuse or the neglect or the chaos came from a primary caregiver when you're younger, we are hardwired to attach. We
Yeah.
want to find primary attachment figures, a figure or figures, and we're looking for that. So we're hardwired to do that. But the person whose ability to do that has now been interrupted by maltreatment in some way. There's I want to attach to you, and that feeling of attachment is also now paired with, and I get hurt. So you
Mm,
see people who I want a relationship, I want a partner, I want these kinds of things. And I'm terrified that I'm going to be abandoned, I'm going to be hurt, I'm going to be left. And they sometimes internalize a message of, I am leavable, I am not lovable. I'm a person who, gets abused. Something about me, led to this. So there's a lot of like guilt and shame that comes along with that kind of upbringing. So it's harder to feel entitled to love and entitled to attachment
mm,
with a partner or friends or, any close attachment relationship because now there's that automatic learned belief of this is how I exist in the world. This is the treatment that I'm expecting.
yeah.
And I think this is why a lot of people also kind of repeat abusive relationships because it's not abstract for them.
Right. There's this degree of kind of, as you were saying, our brain built that shortcut that this is what love is. This is how love
How I can expect to be
feels.
treated.
Yeah, how I can
Yeah.
expect to be treated. And I just wanted to underline something you said about like not feeling entitled to love. Oh, my heart just hurts and also is so familiar with that story. I think that certainly describes my experience and a lot of people's experiences of, getting to adulthood, really yearning for connection and love and having this just underlying sense of there's something wrong with me. It doesn't work for me. I'm broken, etc. And this is where I put in a giant plug for therapy. Because
Me
guess
too, but
what?
I'm
I'm
biased.
yeah. I mean, I'm not a therapist, but also I have reaped tremendous benefits from doing work in therapy around that trauma, around that ache, around that wounding. And the glorious thing is, I can say I'm on the other side of it, like thanks to therapy. And so I guess my next question is Yeah, what does working with that look like, from your professional perspective? I've been on the other end of it, but how would you describe or explain, like, what needs to happen to really process trauma? In the sense that, like, I went to talk therapy for a long time, and it really helped me redirect my thinking and, get clear on a lot of my patterns, but it didn't do the hardwiring, rewiring stuff, and so it wasn't until I have experience with EMDR that has worked really well for me. But I'd love to hear you, Steph, talk about, like, what trauma therapy specifically is and what it's doing that is different and important and valuable and wonderful and magical, and everybody should do it.
Well, I feel like I wanna plug therapy too, not just as a therapist, but as a person who's been a client, on and off for many years. It's been so healing for me to have done my own work, and it also boosts my ability to be a really present therapist. I don't think you can take anybody further than you've gone yourself. So for me, it's almost like a mandate that I need to be on top of my own mental health and my own recovery so that I can be an available, present, process through person that I'm sitting across from other people while they're working through their stuff. So,
Yeah, I
uh,
love that. You can't take anybody further than you've been yourself. That's so true. It shows up in my coaching, certainly, and my recovery and 12-step program. Like, that's how that's kind of built, is that you go through the steps and then you can take people through the steps.
Same
Yeah.
idea. Yeah. So I mean, I'm biased, but my thought is like I don't know if I'd want to see a therapist who hadn't done their own work. I mean, that's my bias.
Yeah.
So when I've gone to therapy, I've actually asked that question, and before I booked an appointment, like, hey, this is really important to me. Have you done your own work too? And anybody who gets defensive about that, I mean, they're not a good match for me.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that.
But that's
Okay.
but I explain my personal bias for that reason. But so trauma work is the way that it's different. I think good trauma work, the way that it's different is you're using the whole person's experience to help them heal. There's some therapies out there that are very what we call top down, meaning go from your cognitions and your intellectual processes and try to change what's happening in your body. I don't love that approach. I think it has its uses, but I think it's very limited. I think you have to use what are called bottom up approaches, meaning that you are using the somatic bodily experiences and the emotional experiences to inform your cognition. Even though it's kind of a bidirectional thing where they inform each other, we know that we get a lot of information from our bodies. And it feels like, at least in this culture in the United States, we really prize cognition, intellect, things like that. And we
Yeah.
ignore our body sense and we ignore our emotions. And for me, that's a
Totally.
huge problem because why would you cut off any mode of information? So our emotions are actually like evolutionarily built to inform us about what is important to us, what we don't like, what we want to avoid, what we want more of. I mean, think about it. If you like something, you usually move towards it and want more of it. If you don't like something, you ignore it or you back away. So,
Right.
right. And that's just the
Yeah.
basic I like or I don't like
Cucumbers?
something.
I move the fuck away from cucumbers. I hate them. They're
You
vile.
and cucumbers.
um, but like put a like yummy piece of chocolate pie in front of me. I'm gonna move toward that.
Hmm. Yeah. And think
But
about
yeah, to be fair, like, my body does not like cucumbers, and I honor and respect that.
okay, so you're doing something that we would call like it's a really adaptive, it has an adaptive function to it. I don't like cucumbers, so I don't eat it. But
Uh-huh.
how many times do people talk themselves out of their emotion because they should do something else?
Oh my god, I just got goosebumps, right? Of like, oh, I'm crying. I shouldn't be crying. I'm gonna stop crying.
Right, and that's a message you picked up somewhere, right? It's the message is probably I shouldn't cry because I look weak. I shouldn't cry because I'm in a female presenting body and the world won't take me seriously because I'm crying, or I
Yeah.
can't. All of these messages that we have around what we should and shouldn't do, they can interrupt our ability to actually get our needs met in a way that's healthy and informative. So with trauma work, the trauma response is actually adaptive. And I'm going to go back to that whole it interrupts with good intention.
Yeah. Okay.
And so I'm going to go back to that. So when you are triggered in trauma, so if somebody's in my office, there's no immediate trauma. There's
Right.
nothing going on, but they might get triggered and their body and their emotions and their cognitions might all react based on a trauma trigger to orient their body towards something: fight, flight, freeze, appease, any of these big
Yeah.
responses that trauma will have you do. And those are the big trauma responses: fight, flight,
Right.
freeze, and appease.
And so just because I feel like the word trigger is now all over the place. And what I'm picking up that I just wanted to kind of pull out and highlight is that a trauma trigger is when our nervous system gets activated into one of those responses you just described,
Yes.
correct?
Yes.
Okay.
So remember, we've now got people who have a trauma history. They now have more vigilance to their external environment. So what we would call, some people would call that hypervigilance, depending on how attentive it is. So if you now have a certain amount of your attention, of your brain power, is orienting to the external environment, and it picks up on some blip that is indicative of the trauma that you've suffered, it's going to try to protect you by
Mhm.
orienting you to some kind of arousal: fight, flight, freeze, appease. So it's going to orient you. So now, like, oh, there's something happening here that's similar to what happened back there. Now you need to attend to it.
Yeah.
So if I'm talking with somebody and we're having a conversation in therapy, or we're doing therapy, and I notice that they stiffen or I notice that they do something, I'm going to ask what just happened. And I'm going to have them attend to what's going on in their body, what's going on in their emotions, and what's going on in their thoughts, so that they can start to learn, oh, this is what my body does in response to this set of conditions. The thing is, our brain it doesn't pinpoint specific conditions, right? So the area of our brain is our limbic system. That's where a lot of the trauma response happens. I mean, it happens in a lot of the brain, but I'm going to try not to do too much of the neuroscience for this podcast.
Yeah, my eyes just went like, okay, I know that word.
It's kind of, it's the midbrain region where our memory centers are, and our kind of emotion
Uh-huh,
detector. It's called the amygdala. Like, it's this part of our brain that really attends to some of these kind of environmental and emotional cues. And
uh-huh.
when it's a trauma response, it doesn't go back to mundane memory where you're like, oh, what's that? And you get curious about it. It goes to a much faster response so that you can orient faster. And if you think about that, that's a really good response if you're actually in danger. So
Right.
the classic example is the veteran who comes back from war,
Right.
and they're living their normal life, and all of a sudden it's 4th of July and the fireworks start going off and they hit the deck, right? They have that
Yeah.
immediate response. And even though they might know it's not gunfire, the smell, the sound,
Mhm.
the boom, like vibration in the body, has enough similarity that your limbic system says, act as if your life is on the line. So the limbic
Right.
system is coming in, your brain is coming in, and it's giving you those cues to act as if you are in danger right now. And if you think about it, that's actually really adaptive, because if there was a gunshot, they're
Right.
more readily available to act than somebody who says, what's that sound? So there's
Yeah.
actually a survival aspect to it that's really beneficial. So your nervous system is actually trying to help you out here. It's like the last
Right.
time that smell, that sound, that vibration happened, you almost died. So I'm going to
Mm.
take away that extra second that you have to start to be curious, and I'm going to put you immediately into action mode.
Yeah. So what's an example of then how that translates to those of us who haven't been in a war zone, who haven't been in the car accident? What's our like
Like, what does that look like? What's
asking
that look like with like complex trauma versus like the, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, right? Because, I would read that like, I would read The Body Keeps the Score, and I'm just like, "I don't relate to this because like, I'm not a veteran, what are you talking about?" So, yeah, what's the kind of everyday tender-hearted human walking around in the world who hasn't had that? How does this show up for us? I will include myself in that.
Okay, I can give you some examples. This has actually come up a lot with people who have attachment trauma.
Yeah.
They go out on a date, and somebody starts, you look really nice. You're really pretty. I want to hold your hand. And then the person has a ooh response, or a disgust response, or a, why would you want to hold my hand? You don't know me. And the
Mhm.
immediate response is one of some kind of aversion. It can be disgust, it can be fear, it can be disturbance, it can be anger. That response isn't what we normally think of as an adaptive response to somebody sincerely saying, you look nice, or I want to hold your hand.
Right.
But because there's some sense of pairing of maltreatment with somebody giving you affectionate attention, that's what that can look
Mhm.
like. So
Yeah.
that's an example. I mean, I can give you many
Right. No,
examples.
I mean, I think that one's pretty relatable.
Well,
Right.
another big one that a lot of people go, "Oh my gosh, I never thought of it that way," is people who have damage attachment. Again, when they actually meet somebody who treats them really well and that is really sweet and really attentive, they feel bored.
Mhm.
They feel bored, they feel suspicious, and it's because their nervous system is so ready for the fight or so ready that they can't read this as like this person genuinely actually just likes me and there's no catch.
Yeah.
So that they can actually feel very boring or very confusing for somebody who's grown up in a very chaotic primary attachment relationship.
Yeah. So in that example, I think this is a lovely segue to what we're, excited to talk about the relationship between trauma and joy, and the idea that that interruption, that response is well intentioned. So build that bridge for me of like, okay, like my little trauma response, like there's this person who's treating me well and is nice to me and I'm bored. What's what is the trauma response's intention, and like what do we do with that?
I like to do something called parts work in my therapy. And basically it's like we all have kind of different parts of ourselves that hold different feelings and needs, and it's actually a really great way to conceptualize trauma, and not even just trauma, like experiences in general.
Yeah.
But I'm gonna just say like the part of you that holds trauma, like the trauma part, is basically trying to it's almost like tapping you on the shoulder and saying like, we don't know what this response is. Like, can you trust that this person's actually being nice to you? And so
Mm,
the interruption that interrupts you from joy with good intention is either we've been here before and you need to attend to this information, or I don't know what this is and I don't know how to react and I'm scared. So it interrupts you to pay more attention to it or to be suspicious of it because it doesn't want you to get hurt again. So
right.
its intention is there's enough in this environment. There's some kind of set of conditions here that's familiar enough to when you've been hurt or
Mhm.
is unknown enough that it's confusing, that it's drawing your attention to that to make you be more cautious or withdrawn or to act. So,
Yeah.
just like even that really classic example with the veteran with the fireworks, the idea here is there's enough similarity in the set of conditions that I'm going to completely interrupt your life so that you attend to it so that we keep you safe and you stay alive. Even though that reaction is overblown, it's not what's needed, it's no longer adaptive, but
Right.
it's trying to protect you from harm, whether it's actual harm like gunfire or it's emotional harm like attachment trauma. So its intention is to keep you safe. Its intention is to, warn you about a set of conditions that's reminiscent of where you've been hurt before. But the problem is trauma memories become static. They get really stuck. They become immutable. And you can't
Yeah.
talk yourself out of it. That's why a lot of people say, I know I'm safe. I know that this person isn't dangerous, but my body's still hijacked. It's because you can't
Yeah.
talk yourself out of it. You have to work with the somatic sense and you have to work with the emotional sense, which is why EMDR is super effective. And there's other,
Yeah.
yeah, and
So
I
for
also
for
do
folks who don't
EMDR. Yeah.
yeah, so for folks who don't know what EMDR is, what is it?
It's eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. You never need to know that again.
Right.
But it,
Yeah.
it uses the body's natural rhythms to process trauma. So the idea behind it is have you ever gone to bed upset? Like you've had a bit of an argument with a friend
Yes.
or something, and then you wake up the next morning and you're like, I don't know what that was about. Let me call them and make up. I feel better. Like the day's better.
Yes.
Your brain does a
Yes,
lot of
specific
processing.
example. My brain was a shitty neighborhood last night, like, because I didn't sleep well, I, like, hermited up too much, didn't have enough human contact, was, like, in a gunky place, and then I woke up this morning and I was like, "Oh, actually, life's pretty great. I'm in a good mood. I'm gonna talk to one of my favorite people this morning, like, things are fine."
That is That is a perfect example. And by the way, I love that I'm one of your favorite people. You're one of
Oh
mine.
my God, you
We've
so are.
we've
I
known
don't
each
know if I already
other.
said this, but like Steph is one of my oldest friends and one of the people I consider a like chosen family sister. So there's that.
Same.
Yeah.
My kids,
Oh, my heart
my
just,
kids call her auntie.
yeah.
We've known each other
Yeah.
for I think over 20 years at this point. Yeah, over 20 years.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
about something
Oh
like
my
that.
God.
Yeah. So it's been a long
Around
time
in the vicinity of 2
in the
decades. Jesus
vicinity.
Christ. I feel
So
old, but it's great. This is the beauty of aging is you get to be friends with people for 20 years.
mhm.
Ah! Okay. So anyway,
so
I woke up in a better place this morning and you were about to explain why.
because when you sleep, your brain does a bunch of stuff. I mean, that's why we actually need sleep. It processes a bunch of things. It clears a bunch of gunk out. Like it does a lot of really important things while you're sleeping. And we have the idea behind EMDR is we have rapid eye movement when we're sleeping, and EMDR mimics that. So traditional EMDR
Okay.
does eye movements back and forth, but now we
Right.
know that you don't have to just do eye movements. You can do any kind of what's called bilateral stimulation. So that's tapping on both sides of the body or listening to music, through both ears, alternating back and forth. But the idea is you're alternating back and forth to do what's called bilateral stimulation, and that calms down the nervous system. And we're realizing we've been doing this intuitively, like throughout the span of human existence. When you watch a parent with their baby, they sway back and forth.
Oh
That's bilateral
yeah.
stimulation. People go for a run, they feel a lot better. Guess what that is? That's bilateral stimulation.
Oh my
Right?
God, I didn't think about
Right.
that.
When
I do
people
that all
do
the
drum
time.
circles and they love drum circles, and guess what drumming is? Bilateral stimulation. So we do all
Oh,
these, we already
yeah.
do naturally, we do a lot of stuff that's bilateral stimulation. And even without thinking about it, it's something that we do to soothe our nervous system rhythm. So that's what EMDR does is it uses bilateral stimulation. So you create a trauma. There's a lot to it. I mean, you do a lot of
Yes,
resourcing
right.
beforehand, which is,
Yeah,
you
this
know,
is not don't try this at home,
don't try this at
kids.
home. No, please go
Like there are
see
lots of
go see a
licensed
trained go see a trained
professionals.
therapist if you're
Yeah.
going to do EMDR. But there's a lot of resourcing and preparing people to do EMDR, but the actual reprocessing is you create a trauma script. And what I like about it is it really does take the whole body into consideration. What's the emotion? How disturbing is it? What's the sensation in your body? What's the belief? The cognition. So it's really looking at the whole experience, which I think is really important. And then you create a trauma script and then you do bilateral stimulation. And what it does is it helps reprocess trauma that has otherwise become stuck. So it works with that part of the brain that's really hard to access just with cognitions. It works using, a full body experience. So I think that's why, it's a really useful trauma therapy. And then there's other great trauma therapies that aren't just talk therapy. There's something called brain spotting. There's something called EFT tapping, which is emotion freedom techniques. All of these
Mhm.
use the brain and the body's natural system. Like we're actually working with our biology to help treat trauma. I think all these things should be in conjunction with talk therapy because
Yeah.
it can be really interesting. You're like rewiring your nervous system so it can feel really vulnerable and it can feel really
Yeah.
weird and,
And like
and
we need to talk about it afterwards, totally.
right, you know,
Yeah. I'm curious, so harkening back. So The Body Keeps the Score is the name of a very famous book about trauma. You're talking about like the way in which processing trauma involves really bringing bodily experience into it. What does it mean that trauma is stored in the body or the body keeps the score?
it's because it's not an intellectual pursuit. It's a
Mm,
felt sense pursuit. It's coded in your brain, it's coded in your nervous system. We're adaptive beings. So the way that our bodies adapt to our environment has to do with the stimuli in our environment. So, a lot of times when people get triggered, it's visceral.
yeah.
People will feel when I do trauma work with people, whether it's EMDR or, some of the Gestalt talk therapy that I do or some of these other protocols that I do, I often check on the body and people get sensations in their chest, in their stomach, in their hands, and their feet. And when I ask them to check that out, even if they don't have a concrete memory, they have a sense of, I have a feeling of wanting to hide, or I notice that I want to run, or there's something happening in my shoulders and they make me want to hunch and get smaller. And it's like your body will tell you a lot about trauma. So I've even had people act out those bodily imperatives, I guess.
Uh-huh.
People who want to hide, which is very common for folks who have trauma when they're really, really young. Because
Yeah.
when you think about what little kids can do, they don't have that many resources to protect themselves. They can pretend to be asleep, they can hide. There's not much they
Yeah.
can do, which, by the way, sometimes people fall asleep during trauma therapy too because it's triggered. And that was what they did, right?
Interesting.
Like
I did
that
not
was
have
their
that
coping.
experience.
But that was their
Uh-huh.
coping skill when the trauma was built. So that's what their nervous
Uh-huh.
system remembers. But I've had people hide in my office. I have pillows and things
Yeah.
like that. And, you know,
And that's a part of gesh
gestalt.
ge Gestalt
Yeah.
specifically. I'd love to, touch bring forward a little bit, like what makes that that therapeutic approach
So effective.
unique or what it is. Yeah.
Yeah, I think because it's so experiential. It's not always an intellectual therapy. It's very experiential. It's how do you attend to your body process, what we call your phenomenology, how you experience the world. How do you attend to that in a way to get more information to become aware of what your needs are so that you can act in a more adaptive way, adaptive to your age, your needs now,
Mhm.
because a lot of times we are
Right.
we are acting in the here and now based on rules that were built in the there and then. So we're doing stuff
Yeah.
that we learned back then because we haven't updated our beliefs.
Right.
We haven't reevaluated things. We've taken some of those things to be procedural. So we just move through the world like it's true. So, that person
Yeah.
who moves through the world like I am unlovable is a truth. Think about how
Mhm.
much that affects their entire every interaction they have, everything they
Oh,
say
dude,
yes or
fuck
no
yeah.
to.
Like, y'all, that was me, right? 100%. It shows up
It
everywhere.
shows up everywhere.
Um,
Well, because now your entire worldview is underlaid by I am unlovable. And that becomes,
yeah.
cognitive behavioral therapy would call that a core belief. There's different languages for different therapies, but it's all the same idea. Emotion
Yeah.
focused therapy, which I'm also a big fan of, would call it the unmet need. And Gestalt would call it the figure. It doesn't actually matter what we call it, but the idea is there's something that has become truth that has not been checked out and not been reevaluated, not been updated. So with Gestalt
Right.
therapy, we are bringing stuff that has become automated into awareness so that people can, oh, wow, this is where it was built. This is how it was maintained. And this is where it is now. And let me hold that next to my experiences here. And look, does this actually fit? Is this still my value? Is this still my experience? Like, what is it like here and now? Holding this there and then message. So the idea
Yeah.
is to start making things on automatic so that you can reevaluate it so that you can make more adaptive, healthy choices, whatever those choices are. And I
Right.
like that about our model about the Gestalt model, because it really allows the person to be the expert on what they do next. So for me, it's actually very inclusive therapy because it's not up to me as the therapist to say, well, you should just go do that because that would be maybe my values or my belief versus they have a whole slew of experiences from their culture, from their family, from their ethnic background,
Right.
et cetera, that's going to inform what they do. So my job is just to help them, bring this stuff into awareness, to really learn how to attend to what their body's telling them, what their emotions are telling them. And then also what are those external factors or those rules that you've learned. And when you have all of that and you can see all of it, then you can make more adaptive choices, whatever they are.
So I'm curious, I want to bring in this sort of joy piece, right? We've definitely talked about attachment and that's related to joy, right? Like love is related to joy. But I know in my experience and people that I've talked to who are not trained psychologists, clinical psychologists, I know there's this relationship between like joy can sometimes feel painful when we have unprocessed trauma, right? That it's just too much or too hard. And I'd love to hear a bit more about that from your perspective.
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is that, there might be a risk to allowing oneself to feel joy because joy requires somebody to be unguarded. Joy
Mm,
requires the nervous system to be relaxed. there's a couple of different nervous system responses. There's a theory called polyvagal theory. It's by this guy, Stephen Porges, and he talks about like different levels of arousal in the nervous system. And in order to feel happiness, contentment, joy, you have to be in what's called ventral vagal, meaning that you're not hypervigilant. You're not scanning the environment
Right.
for safety. You're not doing all these other processes. It's just that I'm available to feel the sunlight on my skin. I'm available to take in the love of my partner. I'm available to really eat this bite of incredibly delicious chocolate cake without the thoughts of, oh, what am I going to have to do to compensate for this cake later? All this ways that we
Right.
interrupt our joy with beliefs about who we should be and what we must do. So I think the reason why some folks who have significant trauma histories have a difficult time getting to joy is because it requires that suspension of vigilance. And
Yeah.
I think something important to say here too is that the people who are traumatized, like, you're not picking these reactions. They're so
Yeah.
automatic. They're in your deep limbic system. They're not in your frontal lobe where you have some agency. You can't talk yourself out of a trauma response. You can't talk yourself out of
Yeah.
vigilance. You have to work with the body systems and, be patient and even work with those parts of you that are trying to protect you with the vigilance. Like, that's why I'm saying, like, the intentions are good. Like, it's like usually those responses are protective or defensive of you.
Right.
And it's hard to tell those parts to stand down because they're like, how can I stand down? If I stand down, you're going to get hurt. So I think that's why
Yeah.
some people have a difficult time really settling into contentment and joy and happiness and that range of emotions, because it requires something that's kept you alive and safe at some point to stand down.
Yeah. And I just thinking about my own
Mm.
experience with all of this and feeling like, not consciously feeling that sense of hypervigilance. It's not like I have been going through the world being like, "Oh my god, I'm gonna die," all the time, but on some level, at a bodily level, feeling really alert and looking out for threat, especially sort of social emotional threat for me, right? It wasn't violence, but it was like, is this person gonna be mean to me? Like, is somebody gonna tease me at any time? Like, reflecting on it in this moment, given my developmental experience, I spent a lot of my adulthood walking through the world really hypervigilant that like somebody was going to tease me, was going to be mean to me. And yeah, that really interrupts my capacity to enjoy a moment. If part of me is always like waiting for somebody to say something mean or to be sarcastic or to correct my behavior. Like I can't access the like relaxation necessary to be like, I'm having a good time and everything's fine.
Yes. And yeah, exactly. And again, think about how it reinforces, because my guess is some of the interactions you have in the world are people being snarky or mean or especially if you go on
Yeah.
the internet and you see some kind of like political
Right.
conversation explosion and you're
Anything.
right.
Yeah.
So I mean there you do have people being mean or being unkind, and that part's a C, and it has a confirmation bias and it continues to reinforce. And what it does
Yeah.
is it doesn't give you the ability to discriminate and to be curious about, is this a person who I can trust or is this a person who I can't? It just tells you don't trust anybody. And that's what makes it
Right.
really hard. And again, if you think about it, its intentions are good. Like if you think about a fence does
Mhm.
two things, right? A fence can keep bad things out, which is a good function, but it also
Yep.
keeps whatever's inside isolated.
Yeah.
So when we have those barrier I know. So when we have those barriers up, they're super useful because they keep us safe, but they also keep us isolated. They also keep us distant, and they continue to perpetuate those feelings of abandonment, isolation, loneliness, all those things that people want to reach out and attach so that they don't feel those feelings, but they also want to feel safe. And one of the hardest concepts I have to work through with people is you can't be safe and be connected at the same time. Like you can't, I mean, you can have that with somebody you've established that with in moments, but what
Oh,
I'm saying
yeah.
is like
Okay.
you cannot be connected without the risk. Like you can't do that.
Right.
So you have to risk letting somebody in. And my guess is even if you find the best partner in the world who you're really connected with, like sometimes they're going to be a jerk and sometimes they're going to hurt you.
I'm mostly giggling at that because I adore Steph's husband and
Who I really have an amazing relationship with. And like,
yeah.
sometimes we piss each other off, which is like
Yeah. Right.
totally healthy in a relationship.
Yeah,
So
like he's great and he can be a butt, like as is true of all of us, right?
as is true of
Like
all of
cuz
us.
we're not
I
all
feel like
perfect
I
all
want
the
to say like
time.
part of his love language is like practical joking and shit giving. So like
Yeah.
that's what I want to say. So it's a very consensual thing. But I mean that's
Yeah.
but it's right. Like it's I also am somebody who grew up in a chaotic environment, and I'm also somebody who's had to do a lot of my own healing work. I've done my own EMDR, my own therapy. I've done something really great called neurofeedback. I've done tapping. I've really done a lot of these very healing things that have healed so much of my attachment wounding. And it's allowed me to really let down those fences for close others, my husband and Kate, including you,
Yeah.
and some of these other really close people. And even though we might occasionally push a button or hurt each other, offend each other,
Yeah.
there's enough understanding that I can work with the part of me that says, "Uh-oh, like you should ghost this person, never talk to them again." I can say like, "Thank you so much for that information and letting me know that this is something that hurts me, but like it's okay. Like let's look, I'm this age with this person now, and I can lean into the
Yeah.
relationship and have a repair." So it's okay to have that mess. Like
Right.
that's how I work with it. It's not that that message goes away. It's just I work with it more adaptively now. Like, hey, buddy, thank you for that
Yeah.
advice to keep myself safe. And
Yeah.
let's
And
look at our current setting and see if I actually need that drastic of a response, which usually you don't.
yeah. Right. And like likewise, like you are the one of the people that I feel safest with in the world, right?
I know.
my heart just got real my heart just grew real big in that
Little
moment,
emo. Me
and
too.
like that took time, you know? We
And
met when
rupture
I
and
was
repair. You and I've had
yeah,
rupture and
and rupture and
repair over the
repair.
2 decades we've been friends, and
Yeah, especially because we met when I was like drunky McDrunky pants, like, um, and you hung out with me through that. But then I got sober, and our relationship really deepened after that because I had a lot more self awareness, and I think in the vein of this conversation, it wasn't until I got sober that I started cultivating that capacity to sort of turn within, and cultivating that capacity to turn within and check in with myself also provided me the capacity to like become more aware of how my behavior impacted other people.
yeah.
Right.
But so if I can speak a little bit, because I think some people who are sober have a really a similar experience to you, and I'm going to speak generally, not about you specifically, but
Yeah.
if you think about a nervous system that's been dysregulated and can't feel safe with people and can't let its guard down, think of what a solution, I'm doing air quotes right now because people can't see me, but
Hmm.
what a solution something like alcohol would be to try to regulate a nervous system, to try to connect, to try to get other needs met that can't otherwise get met when your trauma part is running rampant and being hypervigilant. So,
Yeah. Oh my God. Right. Like that's why I got stoned all the time, was because I didn't know how to like being around. Oh my God. Yeah. I'm just having this moment of I would get drunk or stoned in order to be around people because my system was always worried that people were going to be mean to me. And so getting drunk or getting stoned let that inhibition sort of get quieter so that I could try to connect with people and try to like have fun without having that sort of like constant fear at the surface.
yeah, absolutely.
Um,
And that's one of the reasons I have a lot of compassion for folks who have addiction histories, eating disorders, self-harm, lots of suicidal ideation, because all of these things have something in common. They are an answer, again, quotes, to a problem, and that problem is a dysregulated
yeah.
nervous system. So these behaviors are ways that the nervous system can get needs met that were not met in their environment that should have been met and they weren't. So this is a way to self-regulate. And that's one of the reasons why I think when you treat an eating disorder, when you treat addiction, when you treat somebody who has, maybe like what we call a borderline process or a suicidal ideation process, is that you're treating trauma. I really genuinely
Yeah.
believe that. And because if you just get rid of the alcohol, if somebody just stops drinking or they just stop their eating disorder
Yeah.
behaviors, it's that idea of the dry drunk where they're still doing a lot of the dysregulated processes. They're just abstaining. And I've seen many
Yeah.
people recover, like they stop drinking alcohol, but then they develop an eating disorder, or then some other
Mhm.
thing that is
Yeah.
another way to regulate this nervous system dysregulation. And it's interesting for me because my perspective isn't just like, let's get you sober, although that's necessary. It's let's get you
Right.
sober, but let's also work with the part of you that never learned how to trust and attachment, that never learned how to,
Yeah.
be safe in an environment, that's really looking out for you, that's really trying to keep you safe, but doesn't know how. So that's why I'm saying it's got a good intention. It's really trying to defend you, protect you, all these kinds of things, but it's doing so in a really maladaptive way.
Yeah.
Good intentions, bad methodology.
Yeah, right? Oh, man. Ugh, Steph, this is so good. This has been so good. And picking up on what you just touched on, yeah, like in the 12-step rooms, like we talk about like alcohol, drugs, etc., are just a symptom, right? It like that we take those away and then there's all the stuff that was driving us to that. And that's what the 12 steps work around. And also I'm a big fan of 12 steps plus therapy because of all the stuff that we've talked about, right? Is that there's a body level processing that needs to happen to really unlock the trauma and really be able to show up differently in the world outside of our cognitive
Yeah.
thinking, right? That like I can do my step work, I can talk to things, I can do all of the self-help books and write things down, but until for me I got into the like body unhooking of those autonomic responses, it wasn't until I really did that work that I started to be able to access more joy and more capacity to trust that the people in my life who say they love me do love me, and to embrace that really fully. And so yeah, I just like 3 cheers for therapy, 3 cheers for like dealing with our trauma.
Yeah.
And then if to, get on my little settling is bullshit soapbox that like if we want to really experience joy in our lives, like we got to do the work.
Yes. So we have a saying in Gestalt therapy, what gets in the way of the work is the work. And what
Mm,
I mean by that is if you're wanting joy and you're wanting to cultivate joy, you have to work with what's getting in the way and interrupting the joy. So,
yeah,
my thought is if somebody's like, I really want to be more content, happy, joyful, then I say, well, what's getting in the way of that happening? And oftentimes it's a trauma response. So,
yeah,
my thought is if you work through the trauma response, if you learn what your body's telling you, if you learn how to work with those processes rather than against those processes, then that interruption can start to ease up and it can give you more permission to access joy. But you can't just say, I'm going to go to more parties or I'm going to go like because
right.
you'll have spikes of happiness. Happiness is actually, I want to say it's like kind of easy to get to, like spikes of like moments where you
Hmm.
feel good, not for
Right.
everybody, but contentment and joy, which I think of as a more sustained experience,
Hmm.
that I think you can achieve only if you're working with the interrupters, working with them, not against them. A lot of people
Yeah.
will say, tell that voice to go away or make that thing stop. And I'm
Right.
like, no, like it's doing something for you. It was built at an important time in your life. It was actually probably something you needed to survive at some point. So killing it, divorcing it, murdering it off, all those kinds of things. That's actually not helpful. It's what are you trying to tell me,
Yeah.
buddy? Like what are you telling me about my environment and my needs? Like what are you And then sometimes you can say, "Okay, thank you. You can sit back down now." And sometimes you say, "Oh, you're right. I actually do need to pay attention to this and I need to protect myself." But the idea is you
Yeah.
work with those parts and those messages rather than against them. So that's my answer is trauma interrupts joy and it does so well intentioned, and
Yeah.
in order to achieve more joy, you work with those responses and you take care of the part of you that learned how to adjust to a
Yeah.
chaotic environment.
Yeah, so how do you determine like what's actually right for me versus what's the trauma response? Like how do I kind of cultivate that awareness?
It's a good question. There's definitely no one size fits all. But what I would say is to start getting very curious about your experience. remember, we do so many things that are procedural or automatic because that's just what happens. When we first learn to drive, our hands are at 10 and 2, and we're checking our mirrors and we're really attentive, right? But then, a
Uh-huh.
couple of years into driving, sometimes you get to your destination, you're like, oh, I don't even remember. Like, I wasn't even paying attention. I was listening to my audiobook or whatever.
Yeah.
And that's what our brains do. Our brains automate things. So the idea is if you have a response that feels like that doesn't fit here, or why did I say that? Or hang on a second, I like this person. Why am I avoiding them? Is to start to get really curious. Curiosity is your best friend. Okay. What am I noticing? Like, oh, there's a pit in my stomach. What do I know about this pit in my stomach? Like, what is this familiar from? What is it telling me? What's the emotion? Oh, the emotion is fear. Oh, what am I afraid of? Like, am I actually afraid of this person or am I afraid of something else? And does it belong with that person at this time, or is it something else? If there's a message of get away, hang on, get away from who? This person that I know that I love? Like, I'll use an example. Like, if I have a reaction of get away from Kate,
Yeah.
I know Kate. Kate's like a sister to me. I love her so much. What's going on that came up for me? And then
Yeah. I mean, either I farted or it's a trauma
it
response.
could be both, Kate.
Right.
but
It could
but okay,
be.
so even though I know we're joking here, but like if you
Yeah.
farted and we were in the same
Uh-huh.
place, that would be an adaptive action because it has to do with something that is
Uh-huh.
happening in the here and now. Like, oh God, Kate, like,
Right.
you know,
Yeah.
lay off the keys.
Gross.
Hang on a
That was
second. But
yeah.
if you didn't fart and you're just sitting there smiling at me and telling me how much you love being my friend, and I have a get away from this response, that's probably something old. That's probably something that was built there and then.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with Kate, has nothing to do with me at this age in this friendship. So,
Mhm.
my offer to people is get very
Mhm.
curious. And if you need guidelines for how to do that, what's going on in my body, what's going on in my emotions, meaning labeling an emotion, and what's going on in my thoughts. And if you can get those three pieces of information, you've got a lot of data to start letting you know, does this belong here and now, or is that old stuff from there and then?
Yeah. Okay, and so what if I farted, you have that response, you get in you like, you're aware of like, "Oh, I'm in a trauma response. Like, this isn't related to the here and now." Then what? Like, how do we take care of ourselves around that?
I think it's one of those things where it's like when this thing happened in the past with another person, the outcome was really bad. But
Mhm.
I need to know if this is happening with this person, is this something that can have a different outcome? Can I trust that it might be different with this other person? So,
Mhm.
you know, I know we use the fart example and it's hilarious, but I'm trying to think of something that's a little bit more.
So we're on a date, and like, or we've been going out for a while, and I say I love you for the first time, and you have a reaction, and it's like
Yeah,
disproportionate
perfect
to
example.
that.
Then
Yeah.
then
Then
well,
what?
I think we need to be kind to ourselves, and then I think it's also really
Yeah.
important that we let the other person know enough of what's going on.
Mm.
You know, you can say something like, "I hear you, and I believe that you are sincere," because you wanna check, do I believe that they mean what they're saying, even if you don't
Yeah.
have a good reaction to it? Can I believe that they are sincere is actually a good question to ask yourself. So
Right.
I hear what you're saying. I believe you, but I'm having a really big response, and I don't think it's about you. I think it's about me. I need a minute. And there's that sense
Mm.
of, so I
Mhm.
see you and I'm not abandoning you, but I have to take care of what's going on with me over here.
Yeah.
And that's actually not an uncommon thing to happen is people will have those big responses and then they don't know what to do and they feel like they have to stop themselves. Oh, you pretend like you're not upset, smile and say it back, which is
Right.
an appease response, by the
Ugh.
way, that just say what the person wants to
Yeah.
hear and like just to protect yourself. But you can ask for a minute, asking for a minute to take a breath and say, what's going on here? And you can say, you know what? The last person who told me that they loved me was really abusive, and my body's just reacting. And I know that that doesn't belong with you, but it might take me a minute to be able to adjust to that with you. So, but it's we
Yeah.
don't want to arrest our body responses. We don't want to, cut them off. I mean, there'll be times where that's important, right? Like if you're about to go into an exam, for if you're a student,
Yeah.
you're going to an exam, sometimes you need to be like, "Hey, I see you, buddy. Take a breath. I'm going to put you over here and I'll deal with you when I'm done with the exam." Like sometimes it's
Right.
okay to do that.
Right.
But I always say like acknowledge and set aside, not suppress. And when I say acknowledge and set aside, actually bring it back out when you can. Don't like, because when
Yeah.
people
It's
suppress or
not
when they, push, then then we see all kinds of anxiety disorders and all kinds of other stuff. Like the more you,
Yeah, yeah, like it comes out
yeah,
sideways, right? It shows up at some point. Like if we throw it in the closet and don't ever try to let it out again, like it's going to be like banging, it's going to be getting under the doors, it's going to show up in ways that really don't serve us,
oh,
at least in my
oh no, it shows up in all kinds.
experience.
Well, it shows up in ways like that we think about with, maladaptive action, right? Like, oh, I was
Uh-huh.
screaming at you because you told me you love me. But it also shows up in health
Yeah.
outcomes. I mean, folks that we see with a lot of these kind of chronic illnesses or autoimmune diseases like fibromyalgia or things like that, a lot of them have trauma histories. And my guess is that they had dysregulated nervous
Mhm.
systems that never got a chance to resettle.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it really does come out sideways. So people who try to just lock that stuff down and never look at it, like they pay a price for it. But there's
Yeah.
lots of good work out there now. You mentioned Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score. It's a pretty great book for that. There's I really like a lot of stuff by Peter Levine, who does somatic experiencing. So he's another author who talks a lot about like letting the body inform and how to work with the body.
Mhm.
Some of those books are meant more for professionals, but there are books that are more for the general population. I think one of them is called Waking the Tiger, which is for like,
Mhm.
anybody.
Yeah, and I've been plugging this, but I'll plug it again just as an inroad to this. The kind of Oprah Winfrey book, "What Happened to You," is a really accessible conversation about trauma and like what we've been talking about.
Yes, so that book is Oprah Winfrey and a I think he's a neuroscientist named Bruce Perry. And
Thank you for remembering
that's oh,
his
I
name.
love Bruce Perry. He does the neurosequential
Yeah,
model. He's amazing. So that's remember I'm like my whole world is this trauma
yeah,
world.
yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
Bruce Perry is amazing. He does something called the neurosequential model and he works a lot with CPTSD, complex PTSD. And
Yeah.
his books are really he's got other books too. They're really amazing. But he has a phrase that I like that's name it to tame it, which is if you
Yeah.
can name your emotions or name what's going on somatically and you can kind of take some ownership of it, it can actually like settle something.
Mhm.
Oh, there's that pit in my stomach, and that pit in my stomach is about fear. And then normally when you can do that, you go, oh, and there's like a
Yeah.
something interacts when you can kind of marry your understanding
Mhm.
with your body sense. And I can't cite it for anybody, but I also like feel it to heal it. So I have to actually feel what's going
Yeah.
on in my body to let it
Yeah.
heal. Yeah.
100%. Oh, Steph, this has been gorgeous. Thank you so much. I cannot wait to edit this episode and give it to the world as a gift that it is. As we wind down, I would love to know what brings you joy.
I am a very relational person. I
Mhm.
really deeply care about the people in my life. So quality time is my love language. That brings me a lot of joy. And again, really grateful for the trauma work that I've done because I can get into that ventral vagal state we were talking about. And my favorite thing in the whole world to do, and you know this about me, is to have really good food with my favorite people. So that's
Yeah.
probably one of my most joyous things is like, let's go get something really yummy and let's have quality time and have one of those long leisuring meals where we linger over the table and we have really good things and we just connect. So really connected contact with other people over good food is probably my favorite thing in the world.
Mm. Well, we weren't eating, but I feel like we ticked part of that box. This conversation has been so joyful for me. Um, where can people find you?
A couple of different places. So I have a group private practice in Claremont, California. We're called Goldsmith Psychological Services, and that's our website, just goldsmithpsychologicalservices.com. If you are a mental health professional and you're interested in Gestalt training, gatla.org, Gatla.org. We have an online program, we have an in person program, and we also have a summer residential every year. I'm actually just about to leave for Bulgaria for our summer residential, which is really great because that
So
we work with
fancy.
professionals from like dozens of different countries all over the world. It's a really rich experience.
Yeah, and Steph's going to Kazakhstan next year to train people. How fucking delightful and cool is
It's
that?
really
I
amazing.
am
Yeah,
so
traveling the world doing Gestalt
impressed with my
therapy
day.
is like
Yeah.
a dream. I can't believe I just got back from Australia a couple months ago working with folks there. So it's just like really pleasurable, joyful thing to do to go kind of teach other people to do this thing that I think is just so healing and so amazing. So Gatla.org, goldsmithpsychologicalservices.com, those are probably the best places to get a hold of me.
Awesome. Mm, thank you so much, Steph. This has been beautiful. You're beautiful. Your family's beautiful. The work you're doing in the world is beautiful. Everything is beautiful.
Well, thank you so much. And thanks for having me as a guest. It's been fun to sit across from you this way. We've known each other forever, so this has been fun.
Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please help me grow the podcast by subscribing, leaving a review, and sharing it with anyone you think would benefit from hearing it too. Your support means the world to me. If you'd like to get updates about new episodes, posts, and offerings, please visit settlingisbullshit.com to subscribe to my newsletter. You can also find information there about working with me one-on-one to build your most amazing life. Until next time, remember that I believe in you and that you are fucking awesome.